He killed the only living thing that loved me in this house, snapped its neck like a dry twig just to watch the light fade from my eyes, and he did it with a smile. The next morning, he swaggered into the kitchen with that golden boy smirk, assuming my red-rimmed eyes meant I had finally accepted my place as his silent punching bag. I didn't scream or pack my bags. I simply poured him a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice and placed his favorite blueberry pancakes on the table with a steady hand. His arrogance turned to cold terror when he saw the two uniformed officers standing in the foyer, their badges catching the morning light, and he realized too late that my silence wasn't submission, it was the sound of a cage door locking shut. They say you never really know a man until you live with his children, but I would argue you never really know yourself until you are forced to become a mother to a monster who wears the face of an angel. You know the type of woman I am, because you see her in the grocery store aisle, scanning coupons for organic milk and checking the expiration dates on vitamins, blending into the background like beige wallpaper in a dentist's waiting room. I am the second wife, the replacement model, the one who stepped into a pristine colonial house in Connecticut filled with ghosts and tried to fill the void with pot roasts and ironed shirts, hoping that love was a currency I could earn if I just worked hard enough. Imagine a porcelain plate that has been glued back together so many times that it is more glue than ceramic, holding its breath every time a door slams, terrifyingly aware that the next vibration could shatter it forever. I gave up my career as a graphic designer to manage this sprawling estate, trading my portfolio for a calendar full of soccer practices and parent-teacher conferences, sacrificing my identity to be the glue for a family that never wanted to be fixed. I thought my patience was a virtue, a shield that would protect me from the resentment simmering behind my stepson's angelic blue eyes. But last night I learned that patience is just another word for waiting to be slaughtered, and I am done waiting. The kitchen smells of maple syrup and sizzling bacon, a domestic perfume designed to mask the metallic tang of fear and bleach that still lingers in my nostrils from the cleanup I performed 3 hours ago. Lucas comes down the stairs, the heavy thud of his footsteps echoing the pounding of my heart, and he looks every bit the all-American teenager with his varsity jacket and disheveled hair. He slides into his chair at the head of the table, a spot his father usually occupies, claiming the territory with the casual entitlement of a prince who has just executed a rival and expects the peasants to cheer. I watch his hands, those large and capable hands that can throw a perfect spiral on the football field, and I can't stop seeing them tightening around Rusty's throat, squeezing the life out of 70 pounds of unconditional love while the rain battered the windows. He picks up his fork and stabs the stack of pancakes, the syrup bleeding out like a dark wound, and he looks at me with a smirk that chills my blood, asking if I slept well, while knowing full well I spent the night scrubbing the floor. "Good morning, Anna," he says, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hope you aren't still upset about the dog. It was just an accident after all." I don't flinch. I don't look away. I just pour the coffee and let the steam rise between us like a veil, hiding the fact that my hands are steady, not because I am calm, but because I have already made the call that will end his life as he knows it. Let's go back to the darkness of 10 hours ago, to the rain lashing against the French windows like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry god, setting the stage for a tragedy I should have seen coming. It was his 18th birthday eve, a milestone that should have been celebrated with balloons and cake, but instead, it was marked by the violent eruption of a temper that had been festering for years under the guise of grief. Rusty had barked, just a low warning growl because he sensed the malice radiating from Lucas, and that simple act of loyalty sealed his fate in a way that will haunt me forever. I remember the sound most of all, not the yelp, but the sickening crunch that followed, a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room and leave me gasping in a vacuum of disbelief. Lucas didn't run. He didn't apologize. He just stood there panting with a wild look in his eyes, daring me to scream, daring me to call his father, who was thousands of miles away in Tokyo. He dragged the limp body onto my pristine white duvet, creating a grotesque stain that would never wash out, and whispered that I was next if I didn't learn to keep my mouth shut about his little habits. That was the moment the fear died, replaced by a cold and crystalline clarity that cut through my emotions like a surgeon's scalpel, telling me that if I didn't strike first, I wouldn't survive to see another sunrise. Back in the sunlight, The contrast between the nightmare and the morning routine is disorienting, making me feel like I am walking through a hallucination where the monster is eating breakfast. Lucas is chewing methodically, his eyes fixed on me, waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the tears that he feeds on like a vampire feeds on blood. He reaches for the steak knife to cut a piece of sausage, the serrated blade catching the light, and points it at me in a gesture that is casually menacing, yet plausible enough to be denied. "Dad gets back tonight," he says with his mouth full, bits of food visible, "and I think I'll tell him how you let the dog out and he got hit by a car. Because that's what happened, right, Anna?" He is rewriting history in real time, confident that his charm will outweigh my truth, confident that I am too weak to challenge the narrative he has constructed over years of manipulation. I grip the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turn white, feeling the cold stone grounding me, reminding me that I am still here, solid and real, and that I am not the crazy woman he wants me to be. "Whatever you say, Lucas," I reply, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, hollow and distant like a recording played in an empty room. But underneath the table, my hand is clenched into a fist. He laughs, a sound that used to make me smile but now sounds like nails on a chalkboard, and returns to his meal, satisfied that he has won the game, completely unaware that the board has been flipped. Then it happens. The sharp and authoritative ring of the front doorbell slicing through the heavy atmosphere of the kitchen like a guillotine blade dropping. Lucas freezes, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face because he hates interruptions to his kingdom. "Get that," he commands, not asking but ordering, treating me like the hired help he has always believed I was, assuming it is just a package delivery or a neighbor. I wipe my hands on my apron, a slow and deliberate movement, and I walk past him without a word, feeling his gaze burning into my back like a laser. I don't rush. I let the second ring echo through the house. Let the suspense build. Let him wonder who would be visiting this early on a Sunday morning. I reach the heavy oak door and place my hand on the brass handle, feeling the cold metal against my palm, knowing that when I turn this knob, the world will tilt on its axis. I open the door to reveal the grim faces of authority, not just the local police, but the military escorts from the Citadel Academy, and I step aside to let justice enter. From the kitchen, I hear the chair scrape back. I hear the confusion in Lucas's voice turning to panic, and for the first time in years, I breathe. 8 hours before the doorbell rang, the house was drowning in a silence so heavy it felt like the air pressure before a tornado touches down. A suffocating stillness that settled over the hallway the moment Lucas's bedroom door clicked shut upstairs. I was kneeling on the floor of the guest room, my knees pressing hard into the plush beige carpet that I had picked out 3 years ago, staring at the motionless form of Rusty, who looked for a heartbreaking second like he was just sleeping, except for the unnatural angle of his neck and the stillness of his chest. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse into a puddle of hysterics because that is exactly what Lucas wanted. He wanted to hear the wail of a broken woman echoing through the heating vents so he could drift off to sleep with a smile of satisfaction. Instead, I felt a cold numbness spread from my fingertips up to my shoulders, a mechanical shutdown of my emotions that allowed me to function as a vessel for the necessary tasks ahead. Because in this house, messes were meant to be cleaned, even if the mess was a murder. I reached out and touched Rusty's fur, which was still warm, the golden strands now matted and dull, and I whispered a silent apology to the only soul in this zip code who had ever looked at me without judging the price of my shoes or the authenticity of my smile. The rain outside was hammering against the siding, a relentless rhythm that masked the sound of my ragged breathing as I gathered his 70-pound body into my arms, straining my back, ignoring the sharp protest of my muscles because the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the gaping hole opening up in my chest. Carrying him down the back stairs was a slow and agonizing procession, a funeral march of one, where every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house, threatening to wake the monster who was sleeping soundly upstairs. I moved through the shadows of the kitchen, the stainless steel appliances gleaming in the moonlight like silent sentinels witnessing my shame. And I fumbled with the latch of the back door, my hands slick with sweat and trembling uncontrollably. The moment I stepped out onto the patio, the wind hit me like a physical blow, driving the icy rain into my face and soaking my nightgown instantly, plastering the thin fabric to my skin, as if trying to wash away the sins of this family. I didn't grab a shovel from the shed because the noise would be too loud, so I used the gardening trowel I kept in the greenhouse, dropping to my knees in the mud behind the azalea bushes where Rusty used to chase squirrels in the autumn. The ground was hard, resistant, fighting me for every inch of earth, and I dug with a feral intensity, my fingernails tearing, the mud mixing with the tears that finally started to fall, not because I was sad, but because I was so incredibly angry. I dug until my hands were raw, until the hole was deep enough to protect him from the scavengers, and I laid him down gently, covering him with the wet earth, patting it down with a finality that felt like I was burying a part of myself, the part that was soft, the part that believed in forgiveness. When I re-entered the house, I was a creature of the swamp, dripping mud and water onto the pristine hardwood floors, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of my isolation set in. I stripped off my soiled clothes right there in the laundry room, shoving them into the washing machine along with the blood-stained duvet cover I had dragged down earlier, setting the cycle to heavy duty and pouring in an excessive amount of bleach. The smell of chlorine filled the small room, a sharp and chemical scent that burned my sinuses and cleared my head, acting as an olfactory reset button that scrubbed the scent of death from the air. I walked naked into the downstairs shower, turning the water to scalding hot, standing there until my skin turned lobster red, trying to boil away the sensation of Lucas's cold stare, trying to scrub off the feeling of being a prey animal in my own territory. But as the water swirled down the drain, carrying the dirt and the grief away, something hardened inside me, a calcification of my spirit that transformed the fear into a cold, dense resolve. I wrapped myself in a thick bathrobe, tying the sash tight like a belt of armor, and walked into the kitchen not to weep, but to work, because work was the only thing that kept the madness at bay. I turned on the lights, the sudden brightness exposing every crumb, every flaw, and I began to clean with a manic precision, wiping down counters that were already clean, polishing the silver, organizing the spice rack, needing to impose order on a world that had spiraled into chaos. It was during this frenzy of cleaning that my eyes landed on the digital photo frame sitting on the mantel, its screen glowing softly in the dim light, cycling through a curated history of our happy family life. I stopped wiping the granite island, the rag freezing in my hand, as the screen dissolved from a landscape photo to a picture taken 6 years ago, back when I was just introduced as Mark's fiancée. In the photo, Lucas was 12, his face rounder, his smile missing a canine tooth, looking at me with a shy curiosity that I had mistaken for acceptance, holding a baseball bat that looked too big for his hands. I remembered that day clearly, the way he had asked me to help him tie his shoes, the way he had leaned into my side when we took the picture. A small boy desperate for a mother figure after years of living in a house of grief. I watched the slideshow progress, year by year, the boy growing taller, the jawline sharpening, the eyes losing their warmth and gaining a hooded, secretive quality, the physical transformation of a child into a predator documented in high definition. It was a visual timeline of my failure, a slide-by-slide accusation that I should have seen the signs. I should have noticed when the pranks turned malicious, when the roughhousing became assault, when the lies became pathological. The frame switched to a photo taken last Christmas. Lucas standing behind me with a hand on my shoulder, a grip that looked affectionate to the camera, but which I now remembered had been bruisingly tight, a subtle dominance display that I had dismissed as teenage awkwardness. I unplugged the frame. The screen went black, extinguishing the lie, and the sudden darkness of the device felt like permission to stop pretending, to stop protecting the fragile ego of a boy who had decided to become a man by killing the innocent. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence now humming with a different frequency. No longer the silence of fear, but the silence of a library before a verdict is read. I looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour, the time when the veil between sanity and madness is thinnest, and I knew I couldn't sleep. I couldn't lay my head down on a pillow while the killer slept comfortably upstairs. I needed to do something that would anchor me to the present, something that would prove I was still the mistress of this house. So I opened the pantry and pulled out the flour, the sugar, the cocoa powder, and the bottle of red food coloring. I would bake. I would bake a red velvet cake, his favorite. A cake that was rich and sweet and blood red in the middle. A domestic ritual twisted into a symbol of my endurance. I measured the ingredients with the precision of a chemist, the rhythmic sound of the whisk against the ceramic bowl, acting as a metronome for my racing thoughts, each beat bringing me closer to the dawn. As the batter came together, thick and crimson, I realized that for years I had been operating under the delusion that if I just loved him enough, if I just cooked enough meals and washed enough clothes and kept his secrets, he would eventually soften. I had treated his cruelty as a symptom of trauma, excused his violence as a cry for help, but tonight, staring into the swirling red vortex of the cake batter, I accepted the terrifying truth that some people are simply broken in ways that cannot be fixed with glue and patience. He didn't kill Rusty because he was hurting. He killed Rusty because he enjoyed the power of taking a life, because he wanted to see if he could break me without laying a hand on me. And that realization was the key that unlocked the cage of my paralysis. I poured the batter into the pans, the red liquid smoothing out into a perfect circle, and as I slid them into the oven, I wasn't just baking a cake. I was preparing the stage for the final act of this tragedy. The heat from the oven warmed my cold hands, and for the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of strength, a dangerous and quiet power that came from having nothing left to lose. I washed the bowl, watching the red streaks disappear down the drain, imagining them as the last remnants of my victimhood, and I began to plan, not a plan of escape, but a plan of exposure. The hours ticked by, marked by the rising smell of cocoa and vanilla that filled the house, a deceptive scent of home and comfort that would greet him when he woke up, lulling him into a false sense of security. I frosted the cake as the sun began to bleed through the blinds, my movements steady and artistic, swirling the white cream cheese frosting over the red sponge, hiding the darkness underneath a layer of pristine white sugar. I remembered the camera I had installed in the living room a week ago, a tiny, motion-activated device hidden inside the smoke detector, something I had bought on an impulse after he threatened to burn my painting supplies. I hadn't checked it last night. I had been too consumed by the physical reality of the death. But now, with the cake finished and sitting like a trophy on the counter, the thought struck me with the force of a revelation. The camera had a wide-angle lens. It covered the hallway, the entrance to the kitchen, and part of the living room where the confrontation had started. I didn't need to fight him with words. I didn't need to beg Mark to believe me over his golden son. I just needed to let the truth speak for itself. I walked to the living room, climbed onto a chair, and retrieved the memory card, holding the tiny square of plastic in my palm like a diamond, feeling its edges bite into my skin, a physical manifestation of the evidence that would sever the ties of this toxic family forever. To understand the monster sitting in my kitchen this morning, you have to peel back the layers of time to the day the angel fell, or perhaps more accurately, the day the angel learned that his halo could be used as a strangulation device. It began 7 years ago, not with a bang, but with the hushed whispers of a funeral home and the cloying scent of white lilies that seemed to permanently attach itself to Lucas's skin. He was 11 when his mother died of ovarian cancer, a tragedy that canonized her into a saint and transformed him into the poor, motherless boy who could do no wrong in the eyes of a grieving father. Mark, broken by his own loss, decided that discipline was a cruelty he couldn't inflict on a child who had already lost so much, so he replaced boundaries with indulgence and substituted parenting with blind adoration. I watched from the sidelines, the new girlfriend trying to tread lightly on hallowed ground, as Lucas learned that his tears were a currency that never devalued, a magical pass that could excuse broken windows, failing grades, and eventually, cruelty. Grief is a heavy coat to wear, but for Lucas, it became a cloak of invisibility, a shield he could raise whenever his behavior crossed the line, freezing any criticism in my throat before I could even speak it. I saw the way he looked at people when he thought no one was watching, a calculating assessment of their weaknesses, a predator gauging the distance to the throat. But whenever I tried to warn Mark, I was dismissed as the jealous outsider trying to compete with a ghost. The corruption didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion of morality that started with small thefts and escalated into a systematic dismantling of the household's peace. It began with money disappearing from my purse, $20 bills at first, then hundreds, vanishing into the pockets of designer jeans that Mark bought him to cheer him up. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it with fear. He denied it with indignation, turning the accusation back on me with a gaslighting technique so advanced for his age, it was terrifying. He told his father that I was losing my mind, that I was careless with money, or worse, that I was trying to frame him because I resented his mother's memory. Mark, desperate to keep the peace and terrified of losing his son's affection, chose the path of least resistance, firing our longtime housekeeper under the suspicion of theft, rather than facing the possibility that his golden boy was a thief. I remember the look on the housekeeper's face as she packed her bags, a mix of confusion and betrayal. And I remember Lucas watching from the top of the stairs, not hiding in shame, but standing tall, like a lord, presiding over an execution he had ordered. That was the moment he realized that his father's guilt was a weapon he could wield to remove anyone who stood in his way, and I became the next target on his list, the final obstacle between him and total dominion over the house. The violence, when it finally manifested physically, was wrapped in the plausible deniability of an accident, a signature move that he would perfect over the years. It was 2 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon when the house was empty save for the two of us, and I was carrying a basket of laundry down the main staircase. He was 16 then, having sprouted into a broad-shouldered athlete, the star quarterback who charmed the PTA moms and terrorized the freshmen. As I passed him on the landing, he didn't shove me with a fist. He simply extended his leg at the precise moment my foot was descending, a trip so subtle it would have looked like clumsiness to any observer. I tumbled down the last 6 steps, the breath knocked out of me, my ankle twisting with a sickening pop, laundry scattering like snow over the foyer. As I lay there gasping in pain, looking up at him through tears, he didn't rush down to help. He stood there for a long, silent minute, studying my pain with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. Then, the mask slipped back into place, and he ran down shouting, "Oh my God, Anna, are you okay? You really need to be more careful," his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear if the windows were open. When Mark came home to find me with a cast on my leg, Lucas was the picture of concern, fetching me ice and pillows while whispering to his father that I had been drinking wine before noon, planting the seed of alcoholism to discredit any future complaints I might make. Financial abuse followed the physical, a tightening noose designed to strip me of my independence and force me into a state of total reliance on the family he controlled. He began to sabotage my freelance graphic design business, deleting critical files from my hard drive by accident while playing video games, or spilling soda on my sketches the night before a deadline. He convinced Mark that my work was just a hobby that distracted me from my duties to the family, subtly suggesting that the house was messy or the dinners were late because I was too focused on my little art projects. Mark, exhausted from his corporate law job and desperate for a tranquil home life, asked me to scale back, to focus on supporting Lucas during his crucial college application years, effectively cutting off my lifeline to the outside world. I watched my bank account dwindle, my client list evaporate, and my world shrink to the 4 walls of this beautiful prison, exactly as Lucas intended. He wanted me powerless. He wanted me to have nowhere to go, because a victim who can leave is a problem, but a victim who is trapped is a plaything. I became a ghost in my own life, wandering through rooms that didn't belong to me, driving a car that was leased in Mark's name, eating food paid for by Mark's credit card, existing solely at the pleasure of the 2 men who held the keys to my existence. The most painful realization, the one that kept me awake during those long nights when the silence of the house felt like a heavy blanket, was that I was not just a victim, I was an accomplice. By staying silent, by covering up his accidents with makeup and lies, by accepting Mark's apologies in the form of jewelry instead of demanding change, I had watered the seeds of his malice. I had taught him that women are punching bags that mend themselves, that authority figures can be manipulated with a smile, and that consequences are things that happen to other people. I looked at the monster across the dinner table and saw my own reflection in his eyes, the reflection of a coward who valued security over dignity, who traded her self-respect for a zip code in a good school district. I had allowed him to believe that he was untouchable, a god in a varsity jacket, and in doing so, I had doomed not just myself, but any woman who would come into his life in the future. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the bruises he left on my arms, a nauseating acknowledgement that I had failed to protect the world from him. But last night, when he killed Rusty, the equation changed, the balance tipped, and I realized that while I couldn't undo the past, I could write the ending. This morning, as I stood in the pantry counting the cans of soup to calm my nerves, I realized that the camera I installed wasn't just about catching him in the act. It was about catching myself. I needed to see the truth without the filter of my own denial. I needed objective proof that the evil was real and not just a figment of my stressed imagination. The golden boy myth was so strong, so pervasive, that even I sometimes doubted my own memories, wondering if maybe I really was clumsy, maybe I really was ungrateful. But the camera doesn't lie. It doesn't have a bias. It doesn't care about Ivy League acceptances or football scholarships. It saw the cold precision of his hands on Rusty's neck. It recorded the hateful slurs he whispered. It captured the soul of a psychopath in high definition. I am done being the stepmother who tries to fix the unfixable. I am done being the buffer between Mark and the truth. Today, I am not a mother. I am a prosecutor, and the evidence I hold in my hand is the indictment that will shatter the glass house we have been living in for far too long. The transition from victim to executioner is terrifying. But as I hear the police boots heavy on the hardwood floor, I know it is the only path left to walk. The storm outside was not merely weather, it was a prelude. A chaotic symphony of wind and rain that lashed against the colonial windows of the living room, rattling the glass in its frames as if trying to warn me of the arrival of something far more destructive than a hurricane. I sat in the high-backed armchair with a book I hadn't turned a page of in an hour, my body rigid, my ears straining through the drumming of the rain for the sound of the Jaguar's engine, the car that Mark had foolishly bought Lucas as a pre-birthday gift. Rusty lay at my feet, his golden head resting on his paws, but his ears were twitching, his body tense, because dogs are the barometers of a home's emotional pressure, and he knew long before I did that the air pressure in this house was dropping to dangerous levels. Then came the headlights, two beams of artificial brilliance cutting through the wet darkness, sweeping across the wall like searchlights in a prison yard, followed by the heavy thud of the front door opening and the wet slap of muddy shoes on the marble foyer. Lucas didn't stumble in like a typical drunk teenager. He walked in with the predatory grace of a jungle cat that has tasted blood, his eyes glassy not with intoxication, but with a manic, high-voltage adrenaline that made the hair on my arms stand up. He brought the smell of ozone and stale bourbon into the room, stripping off his wet jacket and dropping it onto the floor, waiting for me to pick it up, waiting for me to play my role in his sick little play. He circled the chair where I sat, moving with a slow and deliberate cadence, trailing his fingers along the back of the upholstery, invading my personal space until I could smell the metallic tang of his sweat. "Still up, Anna," he whispered, his voice smooth and devoid of the slur I had expected, waiting like a faithful dog for the master to come home. Or were you hoping I'd crash the car so you could finally have Dad all to yourself? I didn't answer. I just stared at the fireplace where the embers were dying, knowing that any word I spoke would be gasoline on the fire of his aggression. He laughed, a low sound that vibrated in his chest, and leaned in close to my ear, his breath hot against my skin, deciding to deploy the weapon he knew would wound me the deepest. "You know why Dad works so much, don't you?" he continued, his tone conversational yet dripping with venom. "It's because he can't stand the silence of this house, the silence of the nursery you couldn't fill, the silence of your dead womb." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, ripping open the scar of my infertility that I had spent years trying to heal. And he smiled as he saw the flinch, satisfied that he had found the softest spot in my armor. "You're a dead end, Anna," he spat, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "A biological failure, pretending to be a mother to a son who despises you. And deep down, you know, Mark only keeps you around because he needs someone to manage the staff." Rusty, sensing the malice pouring off Lucas like radiation, rose to his feet, a low rumble beginning deep in his chest, a sound of warning that I had never heard him direct at a human being before. It was a fatal mistake, a breach of the hierarchy that Lucas had established in his mind, and the boy's eyes snapped from me to the dog, widening with a terrifying mix of surprise and delight. "Oh, look!" Lucas sneered, crouching down so he was eye level with the 70-pound retriever. The spare heir has an opinion. The replacement child thinks he can talk back to the prince. I saw the muscles in Lucas's forearm bunch as he reached out, not to pet, but to seize, his hand clamping around the leather collar with a violence that made Rusty yelp in confusion. "Lucas, stop," I said, my voice trembling, finally breaking my silence. "He's just a dog. Let him go. You're hurting him." But my plea only seemed to fuel him, validating his power, proving that he held the things I loved in the palm of his hand and could crush them at will. He dragged the struggling dog closer, ignoring the wet fur and the frantic scratching of paws on the hardwood, looking at me with dead eyes while he whispered to the animal, "She can't save you, buddy. She couldn't even save her own babies. So what makes you think she can save you?" The violence that followed was not a frenzy of blows. It was shockingly, sickeningly precise, a single motion that haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. Lucas didn't punch the dog. He used his leverage, twisting the collar while wrenching the animal's head to the side with the casual exertion of someone snapping a dry branch for kindling. There was a sound, a dull, wet crack that seemed to echo louder than the thunder outside. And then Rusty went limp, his heavy body collapsing onto the Persian rug like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where the world stopped spinning, where the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears and the steady rhythm of the rain against the glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I was frozen in a tableau of horror, staring at the open, unseeing eyes of my only friend, unable to process that seconds ago he had been warm and alive. Lucas stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans, as if he had just finished a mild chore. His face blank, devoid of remorse, devoid of anything resembling humanity. He looked down at the body, then at me, and shrugged. "Happy birthday to me," he said simply, stepping over the carcass of the dog as if it were a pile of laundry I had failed to put away. He walked to the stairs, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room with the evidence of his monstrosity. "Clean this up before Dad gets back," he called out over his shoulder, his voice yawning with fatigue. "I don't want him tripping over your mess." I listened to him climb the stairs, listened to the door of his bedroom close, and then the house settled back into its groaning quiet, leaving me submerged in a darkness that felt bottomless. I didn't move for a long time, sitting there with the corpse of the dog at my feet, the cruelty of his final words echoing in my mind, intertwining with the realization that this was not just an act of violence, it was a message. He had drawn a line in the sand with Rusty's blood, daring me to cross it, assuming that I would crumble, that I would bury the dog and the secret just like I had buried my own dignity for years. But as the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, Arctic clarity, I looked at the camera hidden in the smoke detector above, its tiny red light blinking in the shadows, witnessing everything, remembering everything. He had gone to sleep thinking he had won, thinking he was the predator in the night, but he had forgotten that even the quietest prey has a breaking point, and he had just snapped mine. The silence of the house at 4 a.m. was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against my eardrums, distinct from the terrifying silence of the night before, because this was the silence of a courtroom before the gavel falls. I stood under the spray of the shower. The water turned up to a temperature that turned my skin a raw, angry pink, scrubbing at my arms with a loofah, as if I could abrade the sensation of Lucas's breath on my neck and the phantom weight of Rusty's dead body in my arms. The steam filled the small enclosure, clouding the glass door, creating a private sanctuary where the tears finally stopped flowing, replaced by a dry, arid resolve that felt like desert sand settling in my lungs. I watched the water swirl down the drain, carrying with it the dirt from the garden and the salt from my face, and I made a silent vow that this would be the last time I ever washed away the evidence of his cruelty. I turned off the faucet, the sudden cessation of noise ringing in my ears, and stepped onto the cold tile mat, reaching for a towel not to comfort myself, but to dry the machinery of my body so it could perform the tasks that lay ahead. I looked at my reflection in the fogged mirror, wiping a circle clear with my hand, and the woman staring back at me was no longer the frightened stepmother who walked on eggshells. She was a witness, a prosecutor, and an executioner wrapped in white terry cloth. I walked into the master bedroom, the room that I shared with a man who was currently sleeping in a hotel room 3 states away, oblivious to the fact that his domestic paradise had been turned into a slaughterhouse. My eyes drifted to the closet, to the hidden compartment behind the winter coats where I kept a small suitcase packed with cash and a change of clothes, a go-bag I had assembled 2 years ago when Lucas had first pushed me down the stairs. The temptation to grab it, to throw it in the car and drive until the gas ran out and the road signs changed languages, was a physical pull, a siren song of escape that promised safety at the cost of my dignity. But as I reached for the handle, my hand hovered and then dropped, because running away would make me the fugitive. Running away would let him spin the narrative that I was unstable, that I had abandoned the family, that I was the villain. I remembered the camera footage, the digital truth resting in the pocket of my robe, and I realized that I didn't need to run from the monster, because I held the silver bullet that would put him down. I kicked the suitcase back into the darkness, shutting the closet door with a definitive click, choosing to stand my ground in the house that I had cleaned, decorated, and paid for with my peace of mind. The first call was the hardest, not because of emotion, but because it required the precision of a military operation, so I sat at the mahogany desk in the study and pulled out the brochure for the Citadel that I had hidden inside a cookbook months ago. I dialed the emergency admissions number, the private line for wealthy families who needed discreet interventions for their troubled sons, and waited for the voice on the other end to answer. "This is Anna Vance," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had plagued me for years. "I am activating the enrollment for Lucas Vance, effective immediately, and I require the extraction team to be at my residence by 7:30 a.m. The admissions officer on the other end hesitated, mumbling something about paperwork and standard processing times, trying to wrap the bureaucracy around the urgency of my request. "I have the signed consent forms from his father on file with your legal department," I lied smoothly, knowing that Mark had signed a preliminary inquiry years ago that was vague enough to pass. "And if you are not here, I will be calling the press to discuss why your institution refused to help a family in crisis." The threat was calculated, professional, and it worked. The tone on the other end shifting instantly to compliance, assuring me that the officers would be dispatched within the hour. I hung up the phone, feeling a cold thrill of power, the first tangible victory in a war I had been losing for 7 years. The second call was to the local police station, but not to the emergency dispatch. Instead, I dialed the direct line of Sergeant Miller, a man who had attended our 4th of July barbecues and who had once looked at my bruised arm with a knowing suspicion that he never voiced. "Hello, Sergeant. I'm sorry to wake you," I said, looking out the window at the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the trees. "But I have a situation at the Vance residence that requires a police presence, not for an arrest, but for a civil standby." I explained that I was having my stepson escorted to a boarding school and that, given his history of aggression, I feared for the safety of the transport team and myself. I didn't mention the dog. I didn't mention the murder, because I needed the police to be there as neutral observers first, to witness the monster when he was cornered, to see the violence with their own eyes before I played the tape. Miller, sensing the gravity in my tone and perhaps remembering the times he had seen Lucas's cold eyes around town, agreed to come himself, promising to park down the street until the Citadel team arrived. I thanked him, my hand gripping the receiver so tight my knuckles turned white, knowing that I was effectively inviting the law into my home to arrest the son of a prominent man, a move that would scorch the earth of our social standing forever. The third call was the trap, the lure that would bring the final witness to the stand. So I took a deep breath and dialed Mark's cell phone, knowing that he would answer even at this ungodly hour because he was a workaholic who never slept well. "Anna?" His voice was groggy, laced with the irritation of being woken up. "Is everything okay? It's 5 a.m. I forced a tremor into my voice, summoning the ghost of the weak woman I used to be, manipulating his perception of me to ensure his compliance. "It's Lucas," I whispered, letting a sob catch in my throat. He's in a state, Mark. I've never seen him like this. He's tearing the house apart and screaming for you." I didn't tell him about Rusty. I didn't tell him about the police. I just painted a picture of his golden boy in distress, knowing that Mark's savior complex would override his logic. "I'm coming," he said instantly, the irritation replaced by parental panic. "I'm 2 hours away. I'll drive. Just lock yourself in the bedroom and don't provoke him." I agreed, hanging up the phone with a click that felt like the closing of a coffin lid, knowing that by the time he arrived, the stage would be set, the actors would be in place, and he would walk into a tragedy that he could no longer edit. With the calls made and the timeline set, I returned to the bedroom to dress for the occasion, shedding the bathrobe and standing naked in the center of the room one last time. I didn't reach for my usual jeans and sweater, the camouflage of the suburban housewife. Instead, I chose a black dress, severe and elegant, with a high neckline that covered the bruises on my collarbone and long sleeves that hid the tremors in my arms. I sat at the vanity and applied my makeup with the precision of a war paint, concealing the dark circles under my eyes, adding a flush of color to my pale cheeks, and painting my lips a deep, matte red. I opened the jewelry box and took out the string of pearls Mark had given me for our 5th anniversary, a peace offering after one of Lucas's tantrums, and fastened them around my neck. The cool weight of the pearls felt like a collar, a reminder of the bondage I was about to break. But to the outside world, they would look like a symbol of matriarchal dignity. I pulled my hair back into a tight chignon, revealing the sharp angles of my face, transforming myself into a statue of justice that could not be moved by tears or threats. I walked out of the bedroom and stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the dark foyer where the shadows were beginning to retreat before the rising sun. The house was silent, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a stage before the curtain rises, charged with potential energy and the inevitability of the coming conflict. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the distant sound of a car passing on the main road. I placed my hand on the banister, the wood smooth and cool under my palm, and began to descend, my heels clicking softly on the steps, a rhythmic countdown to the end of my life as a victim. I wasn't going down there to make coffee. I wasn't going down there to serve. I was going down there to preside over the dissolution of a lie. I walked through the hallway, past the empty space where Rusty's bed used to be, and pushed open the swinging door to the kitchen, ready to prepare the final meal, ready to greet the monster with a smile that was actually a blade. The kitchen was a sanctuary of deceptive normalcy, filled with the comforting, buttery aroma of sizzling bacon and the rich, dark scent of brewing coffee, smells that were designed to trigger a primal sense of safety in anyone who walked through the door. I moved through the space with the efficiency of a ghost, my black dress swishing softly against the cabinets, my pearls catching the early morning light that filtered through the blinds, casting long, prison-bar shadows across the granite countertops. I had spent the last 20 minutes erasing the final microscopic traces of the night's horror, scrubbing the floor where a muddy footprint had remained, polishing the faucet until it gleamed like a mirror, and arranging the breakfast table with the obsessive symmetry of a Last Supper. In the center of the table sat the red velvet cake, its cream cheese frosting swirled into perfect, innocent peaks, a stark contrast to the blood-red crumb hidden beneath. And next to it, I placed a small, rectangular box wrapped in silver paper, the gift that Lucas was expecting. I wasn't cooking with love. I was cooking with the cold precision of a chemist preparing a lethal injection, transforming flour and sugar into the final meal of a condemned man who didn't yet know he was walking to the gallows. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs, a sound that used to make my stomach clench with anxiety, but now simply registered as a cue, the antagonist entering stage left for his final scene. Lucas shuffled into the kitchen, his hair matted from sleep, wearing only his flannel pajama bottoms, scratching his chest with a grotesque casualness that made my skin crawl. He stopped in the doorway, blinking against the brightness, his eyes scanning the feast. I had prepared the stack of blueberry pancakes, the crispy bacon, the fresh orange juice, and a slow, sickening grin spread across his face. He didn't see a woman in mourning. He saw a woman who had been broken, a stepmother who had realized the futility of resistance and was now trying to buy her safety with carbohydrates and servitude. Well, he croaked, his voice thick with morning phlegm and arrogance. Looks like someone finally remembered it's my birthday. Or maybe you're just trying to apologize for being such a bitch last night. He walked past me, deliberately bumping his shoulder against mine, a petty assertion of dominance, and pulled out the chair at the head of the table, sitting down with a heavy sigh of satisfaction, as if he were a king surveying his tribute. He didn't notice the coldness in my eyes or the rigid set of my jaw, because narcissists never look at their victims. They only look at what their victims can provide for them. He reached for the pitcher of orange juice, pouring a glass with a steady hand, completely unbothered by the fact that less than 8 hours ago, those same hands had snapped the neck of a living creature. "This is better, Anna," he said, taking a long gulp and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, ignoring the linen napkin I had placed there. "I knew you'd come around eventually, because let's face it, where else are you going to go? You need Dad's money, and to get Dad's money, you need to keep me happy." He picked up his fork and stabbed a stack of pancakes, the syrup oozing out like dark blood, and he looked at me with a smirk that was meant to be charming but looked predatory. "And about the dog," he continued, chewing with his mouth open. "Don't look so tragic. I did you a favor. That thing was old and smelled like wet carpet. Now we can get a real dog, maybe a German shepherd, something that actually listens when I give a command." I stood by the sink, my hands clasped tightly in front of me to hide the way my fingers were itching to grab the cast iron skillet, forcing myself to remain the statue of domestic obedience for just a few minutes longer. "I just want everything to be perfect for your 18th birthday, Lucas," I said, my voice smooth and flat, devoid of the tremor he was listening for. "It's a big day, the day you officially become an adult in the eyes of the law." He laughed, a short, barking sound, and pointed his fork at me, a piece of pancake dangling from the tines. "The law doesn't apply to this family, Anna. Haven't you learned that yet? Dad fixes everything, and what he can't fix, I handle." He reached for the silver-wrapped box next to the cake, his eyes lighting up with greed, assuming it was the keys to a new car or a high-limit credit card. "So, what's this? The peace offering?" he asked, tearing at the paper with greasy fingers. He ripped off the wrapping to reveal the box, but before he could open the lid, before he could see that inside was not a key, but simply a heavy, folded piece of paper, the copy of his acceptance letter to the military academy, a sound cut through the air, freezing him in place. The sharp, mechanical chime of the doorbell sliced through the heavy atmosphere of the kitchen like a guillotine blade dropping, severing the tension just as Lucas's fingers were prying under the lid of the silver box. He froze, his eyebrows knitting together in a spasm of irritation, the expression of a spoiled child whose climactic moment of gratification had been rudely interrupted by the banality of the outside world. He looked at the door, then at me, his lip curling with a familiar disdain as he waved his hand in a dismissive shooing motion, treating me like a servant who had failed to anticipate the intrusion. "Get that," he commanded, his voice dripping with impatience. "And whoever it is, tell them we aren't buying anything. Tell them I'm in the middle of opening my presents." He turned his attention back to the box, his greed overriding his curiosity, assuming that the world revolved around his birthday and that any interruption was merely a temporary glitch in his perfect reality. I didn't answer him. I didn't nod in submission, as I had done 1,000 times before. I simply turned on my heel, the friction of my shoes on the tile sounding like a whisper of defiance, and walked out of the kitchen without a backward glance. The hallway stretched out before me, long and shadowed, and for a moment I felt like a prisoner walking the Green Mile. But as I neared the heavy oak door, I realized I wasn't the one walking to the chair, I was the one pulling the switch. I reached the door, my hand hovering over the cold brass latch for a heartbeat. A singular second where I acknowledged that once this barrier was breached, the sanctity of our private hell would be public record. I pulled the door open, the hinges moving silently thanks to the oil I had applied months ago, and the morning air rushed in, crisp and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and impending justice. Sergeant Miller stood on the porch, his face grim and set in stone, the brim of his hat dripping with the remnants of the night's rain. And behind him stood 2 men I didn't know, men who wore the gray, impeccably pressed uniforms of the Citadel. They were large men, built like granite walls, their expressions devoid of pity or malice, radiating the quiet, terrifying competence of professionals who specialized in subduing the unruly sons of the elite. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to offer explanations or apologies. I simply stepped back, opening the path wide, inviting the consequences into the sanctuary of the Vance family home. Miller nodded at me, a microscopic dip of his chin that acknowledged the gravity of what I had done, and then he stepped across the threshold, his heavy boots making a dull, authoritative thud on the hardwood floor. The 2 military escorts followed, their movements synchronized and silent, filling the foyer with an overwhelming presence of authority that sucked the oxygen out of the room. We walked down the hallway in a grim procession, the sound of our footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of doom, approaching the kitchen where the monster sat unaware, probably still fantasizing about the sports car he thought he was getting. I could hear him before we arrived, his voice raised in a petulant shout, "Anna, what is taking so long? If that's the neighbor, tell him to get lost." The irony of his command hung in the air, bitter and sweet, as I pushed open the swinging door and stepped aside, allowing the 3 men to flood into the room. The kitchen, which had been a warm tableau of domestic breakfast just moments ago, instantly transformed into an interrogation room, the bright morning light reflecting harshly off the badges and the brass buttons of the uniforms. Lucas was sitting with the box half open, a piece of bacon halfway to his mouth, and the transformation of his face was a slow-motion collapse of his entire worldview. His jaw went slack, the fork clattered onto the china plate with a jarring ring, and the color drained from his skin so fast it looked like the blood had simply evaporated, leaving him gray and ghostly against the dark wood of the chair. He looked at the police officer, then at the 2 stone-faced soldiers, and finally his eyes landed on me, wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdled into panic. "What is this?" Lucas stammered, his voice cracking, stripping away the deep, affected baritone of manhood he tried so hard to project, revealing the frightened child hiding beneath the bully's skin. He stood up, knocking his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor, and instinctively backed away until his hips hit the granite counter, cornered in his own kingdom. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, his hand resting casually but meaningfully near his belt, not on his gun, but on the handcuffs tucked into the back of his waistband. "Lucas Vance," Miller said, his voice level and devoid of the friendly warmth he usually used at neighborhood barbecues. "We are here to assist in your transfer to the Citadel Military Academy, effective immediately." Lucas blinked, his brain misfiring, unable to process the words, looking down at the silver box on the table as if it might contain a weapon or an explanation. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, a nervous smile flickering on his lips as he tried to find the punchline. "No, you've got the wrong house. My dad. Does my dad know you're here?" He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to step in, to fix it, to tell them it was a mistake. But I stood next to one of the Citadel officers, my arms crossed, my face a mask of porcelain indifference. "Your father signed the papers, Lucas," I said, my voice cutting through his denial like a scalpel, and I called them. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach, doubling him over emotionally as he grasped the magnitude of my betrayal. The arrogance that had armored him for years, the belief that he could charm or threaten his way out of any situation, disintegrated in the face of these silent men who didn't care about his varsity jacket or his charming smile. One of the Citadel officers stepped forward, holding out a plastic bag, his voice a low rumble of command. "Empty your pockets, son, and place your phone on the table." Lucas looked at the phone, his lifeline to Mark, his tool of manipulation, and made a move to grab it. But the officer was faster, his large hand clamping down on Lucas's wrist with a speed that blurred in the air. "Don't make this difficult," the officer warned, his grip unyielding. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the way where you wake up in the van with a headache." Lucas froze, the pain in his wrist registering, and he looked at me one last time, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like heat on my skin. "You bitch," he hissed, the venom spilling out. "You planned this? You think you can get rid of me?" I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I just pointed to the open box on the table where the acceptance letter lay. "Happy birthday, Lucas," I said softly. "It's time to grow up." Just as the officer's grip tightened on Lucas's wrist, the front door exploded open with a violence that shook the frame, followed by the frantic, thundering footsteps of a man running on pure adrenaline and parental terror. Mark burst into the kitchen, his chest heaving, his tie undone, and his face gray with exhaustion from the 3-hour drive he had made in under 2, his eyes wild as he scanned the room for the disaster I had promised him. He took in the scene with the bewildered paralysis of a man waking up in a war zone, seeing his son pinned against the granite counter by 2 uniformed strangers, seeing the local police sergeant standing guard, and finally seeing me, standing calmly by the sink with my arms crossed over my chest. "Get your hands off him!" Mark roared, his instinct to protect overriding his confusion, his lawyer brain instantly engaging as he moved toward the officers with a threatening finger pointed at their chests. "I am Mark Vance. I am an attorney, and unless you have a warrant signed by a judge, you are trespassing on private property and assaulting a minor." He turned to me, his eyes burning with a mixture of relief that Lucas was alive and fury that I had orchestrated this ambush, and he screamed, "Anna, what the hell have you done? You told me he was having a breakdown, not that you were having him arrested." Lucas, sensing the arrival of his savior, instantly shed the skin of the cornered rat and slipped back into the role of the victimized child, a transformation so fluid and practiced it was almost impressive to watch. He wrenched his arm free from the momentarily distracted guard and threw himself toward his father, tears erupting from his eyes on command, his voice pitching up into a hysterical wail. "Dad, help me! She's crazy!" he sobbed, clutching Mark's jacket with trembling hands, burying his face in his father's chest like a 5-year-old. "She brought these guys here. She's trying to send me away. She's been lying to you about everything." Mark wrapped his arms around his son, glaring at the officers with a protective ferocity, his resolve hardening as he felt Lucas shaking against him. "It's okay, son. I'm here. Nobody is taking you anywhere," Mark soothed, stroking Lucas's hair. Then he turned his gaze on me, cold and accusatory. "Send them away, Anna," he commanded, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Send them away right now, or we are done. I will not let you traumatize this boy because you can't handle a little teenage rebellion." I watched them. The tableau of the devoted father and the misunderstood son, a lie built on 7 years of my silence, and I knew that words would no longer suffice to break the spell. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I simply reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out the small black remote control for the wall-mounted television that hung above the breakfast nook. "I'm not the one traumatizing him, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the noise of Lucas's sobbing. "And before you make a decision that destroys our lives, you need to see exactly who you are protecting." I pointed the remote and pressed play, the screen flickering to life, displaying the grainy but unmistakable black and white footage of the living room from 10 hours ago. The room fell silent, the only sound coming from the television speakers, amplifying the cruel, taunting voice of Lucas as he paced around the armchair where I sat. Mark looked up, confused, but his eyes locked onto the screen as he heard his son's voice, clear as a bell, saying, "You're a dead end, Anna, a biological failure," followed by the low growl of Rusty. Lucas stopped crying instantly, his head snapping toward the TV, his face draining of color as he realized that his private performance was being broadcast to the one audience member who mattered. The video played on, relentless and unedited, showing the moment Lucas grabbed the dog, the struggle, and then the sickening, audible crack of Rusty's neck snapping, a sound that seemed to reverberate off the kitchen tiles. On the screen, Lucas dropped the limp body and wiped his hands, his face twisted in a smirk of pure malice, and then he turned to the camera to me and said, "Happy birthday to me." In the kitchen, the reality of the footage crashed into Mark like a freight train, shattering the image of the grieving, innocent boy he had cherished since his wife died. Mark pushed Lucas away from him, stumbling back as if he had been burned, his hand covering his mouth to stifle a gag of horror, his eyes wide and watering as he looked from the screen to the stranger standing in his kitchen. You killed the dog?" Mark whispered, his voice broken, the lawyer gone, leaving only a devastated father. Lucas tried to reach for him again, stammering, "Dad, no, it's a fake." She edited it. "You know how she is with computers." But the lie was weak, dissolving in the face of the visual evidence, and for the first time, Mark flinched away from his son's touch. I stepped forward, placing the remote on the counter next to the uneaten cake, and looked Mark dead in the eye, delivering the ultimatum that would end the standoff. "You have 2 choices, Mark," I said, my voice steady. You can let these gentlemen take him to the Citadel, where he can get the help and discipline he clearly needs, or I give this flash drive to Sergeant Miller right now." I paused, letting the weight of the threat settle in the room, watching Mark's shoulders slump in defeat. "If I give it to Miller, Lucas will be arrested for animal cruelty and menacing. It will be on the front page of the paper by noon, and your career, along with his future, will be over." Mark looked at Lucas, seeing not the golden boy, but the monster who had murdered a defenseless animal to terrorize his wife, and the fight went out of him. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the dust on his cheek, and stepped aside, clearing the path between the officers and his son. "Take him," Mark whispered, the words barely audible, but they were a verdict that could not be appealed. The Citadel officers moved in instantly, efficient and devoid of emotion, pulling Lucas's hands behind his back, the metallic click-click of the handcuffs, signaling the end of his reign of terror. Lucas screamed, a raw, primal sound of rage and disbelief, trashing against the restraints, spewing profanities that would make a sailor blush, revealing the true face of the demon I had lived with for years. "You traitor! I hate you! I'll kill you for this!" he shrieked at his father, but Mark just turned his back, leaning heavily against the refrigerator, unable to watch as his son was marched out the back door. I stood still, watching the procession leave, feeling a strange hollowness where the fear used to be, listening to the heavy boots fading down the hallway, followed by the slam of the van door. The kitchen was suddenly quiet again, save for the hum of the appliances and the ragged breathing of a man whose world had just collapsed. But as I looked at the empty chair where the monster had sat, I knew that for the first time in forever, the house was finally safe. The silence that followed the slamming of the van door was not the peaceful quiet of a library or the reverent hush of a church, but rather the deafening, ringing vacuum left behind after a bomb has detonated, sucking all the oxygen and certainty out of the room. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my arms still crossed over my chest as if holding my ribcage together, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of morning sunlight that fell across the uneaten birthday cake, a grotesque centerpiece for a celebration that had turned into a funeral for our family life. Mark was still leaning against the refrigerator, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the silent, racking sobs of a man who has just realized that his love was the very instrument of his son's destruction. And for the first time in 7 years, I felt no urge to comfort him. In the past, my role as the dutiful wife would have been to rush to his side, to wrap my arms around him and whisper lies about how everything would be okay, how we would get through this together, but the woman who did those things had died last night along with the dog. Instead, I felt a strange, clinical detachment, a numbness that was likely a mercy from my nervous system, protecting me from the crushing weight of the guilt that I knew would come later, the guilt of being the one who called the executioner. I looked at the silver box on the table, the acceptance letter still peeking out, and realized that I had just dismantled a life that I had spent nearly a decade trying to build, and while the foundation was rotten, the collapse was still terrifying to behold. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the morning began to ebb away, leaving behind a leaden exhaustion that settled deep in my bones, making the simple act of standing upright feel like a Herculean task, yet I knew I couldn't sit down. Not yet. Not while the final act was still unwritten. Mark finally lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen, his face aged by 10 years in the span of 10 minutes, and he looked at me with a bewildered expression, as if he were seeing a stranger standing in his kitchen instead of the woman he had woken up next to for years. "He's gone," Mark whispered, the words cracking in the middle, a statement of fact that sounded like a question, as if he were waiting for me to tell him it was all a bad dream, and Lucas was actually upstairs playing video games. He took a step toward me, his hand reaching out instinctively for connection, for someone to share the burden of this catastrophic failure. But I took a deliberate step back, maintaining the physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm that had opened between us. "You knew," he said, his voice gaining a sudden desperate edge, accusing me to deflect from his own shame. "You knew he was dangerous. Anna, why didn't you scream louder? Why didn't you force me to see it before it got to this?" It was the classic defense of the enabler, shifting the blame to the whistleblower, trying to make my silence the crime rather than his blindness. And the injustice of it sparked a final, cold flare of anger in my chest. I screamed in every language I knew. "Mark," I replied, my voice calm and steady, echoing off the stainless steel appliances. "I showed you the bruises. I told you about the money. I begged you to set boundaries, and every single time, you chose the path of least resistance because it was easier to think I was a nagging stepmother than to admit your son was a monster." I turned away from him, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his denial, and walked out of the kitchen, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a finality that signaled the end of my tenure in this house. I climbed the stairs slowly, running my hand along the banister, feeling the smooth wood that I had polished so many times, realizing that I was touching it for the last time, saying a silent goodbye to the structure that had been my prison. I entered the master bedroom, the space that was supposed to be a sanctuary but had become an interrogation room where I was constantly forced to defend my sanity, and I walked straight to the closet where my suitcase was waiting. I had packed it days ago in my mind, but physically I had only thrown the essentials in this morning. A few changes of clothes, my passport, my sketchbook, and the small amount of cash I had managed to squirrel away from the grocery budget over the years. I didn't take the jewelry he had given me. I didn't take the designer bags or the expensive coats that were bought to dress me up like a doll for his corporate dinners. I only took what was undeniably mine, the fragments of the identity I had possessed before I became Mrs. Vance. I zipped the bag shut, the sound loud in the quiet room, and grabbed the handle, feeling the weight of my freedom, a weight that was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I walked over to the vanity and looked at myself in the mirror one last time, seeing the faint lines of stress around my eyes, the pale complexion of a woman who had lived indoors for too long, but in the pupils, there was a spark of life that had been missing for years. When I came back downstairs, carrying the suitcase, Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the slice of red velvet cake, looking like a man who had been shipwrecked on a desert island. He looked up as I entered, his eyes widening when he saw the bag, the realization of what was happening hitting him with a second wave of panic. "Anna." "No," he said, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "Where are you going? You can't leave. Not now. Not when. We need to figure this out. We need to call a lawyer for Lucas. We need to handle the press." He was already slipping back into fix-it mode, trying to manage the crisis, assuming that I would be his partner in damage control, his co-conspirator in sweeping the dirt under the rug once again. "I'm not part of the we anymore, Mark," I said, stopping in the doorway, refusing to re-enter the space where I had been tormented. I did what I had to do to save myself, and in a way, to save Lucas from becoming a murderer, but I cannot live in the wreckage that you allowed to accumulate. He walked toward me, tears streaming down his face again, pleading now, stripping away the dignity of the high-powered attorney. "I'll change, Anna. I swear. I'll listen. We can go to therapy. I didn't know how bad it was. Please don't leave me alone in this house." I looked at him, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, a pang of the love I had once felt for the charming, broken man who had promised me a family, but I crushed it instantly, knowing that his repentance was born of fear, not understanding. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," I said softly, delivering the autopsy report of our marriage. "And even now, you're not crying because I was hurt, you're crying because you lost your comfortable life, because the illusion is shattered." I reached down to my left hand and slid the diamond engagement ring off my finger, feeling the resistance of the metal, the symbol of a promise that had been broken 1,000 times in 1,000 silent ways. I placed the ring on the hallway table, the gold making a dull clink against the wood, leaving it next to the bowl of potpourri I had arranged last week. "That bought you a housekeeper, a nurse, and a punching bag for your son," I said, meeting his eyes for the final time. "But it didn't buy you a wife." Mark stood frozen, his mouth open as if to speak, but no words came out, because there were no arguments left to make, no settlements to be negotiated. I turned my back on him, gripped the handle of my suitcase, and walked to the front door, opening it to the bright, blinding light of the mid-morning sun. The walk to my car was a surreal journey, the gravel crunching under my feet, the birds singing in the oak trees as if the world hadn't just ended, the neighborhood looking agonizingly normal with its manicured lawns and white picket fences. I paused for a moment by the azalea bushes, looking down at the patch of disturbed earth where Rusty lay, the mud already beginning to dry in the sun, hiding the raw wound in the ground. I didn't cry. I had no tears left, but I placed my hand on my heart and whispered a promise to him. A promise that his death was the catalyst that burned the whole rot down, that he was the hero of this story, not me. I got into my sedan, a modest car that I had bought before the marriage, the only asset that was solely in my name, and started the engine, the vibration of the steering wheel, feeling like the heartbeat of a new life. I didn't look back at the house as I pulled out of the driveway. I didn't look at the window where Mark was surely watching. I just kept my eyes on the road ahead, driving away from the zip code, away from the title of stepmother, away from the silence. As I merged onto the highway, watching the speedometer climb, I felt the phantom sensation of a collar being unclasped from my neck, the air rushing into my lungs, tasting sweet and sharp, tasting like uncertainty, tasting like freedom. 3 months later, the silence in my apartment is different. It is not the heavy, loaded silence of a minefield, but the light, airy silence of a blank canvas waiting to be painted. I live in a small one-bedroom walk-up in the city, miles away from the sprawling suburbs, a place with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it is mine, paid for with the money I earn from my graphic design work, which I have restarted with a ferocious hunger. I haven't spoken to Mark since that day, though his lawyers sent a generous settlement offer which I signed without reading, donating half of it to an animal shelter in Rusty's name and keeping the rest as a safety net. I know Lucas is still at the Citadel, stripped of his phone and his freedom, forced to confront the demons he nurtured for so long. And while I don't know if he will ever truly change, I find comfort in knowing he can no longer hurt anyone else. I still have nightmares sometimes, dreams where I hear the snap of a neck or see the flash of a knife, waking up in a cold sweat with my heart hammering against my ribs. But the difference is that when I wake up, I am alone, and I am safe. I make a cup of tea, Earl Grey, hot and strong, and I sit by the window watching the city lights, realizing that justice isn't always a gavel banging in a courtroom or a villain rotting in a jail cell. Sometimes, quiet justice is simply the act of reclaiming your own voice after years of being silenced. It is the breakfast you cook for yourself, the art you create for no one else, and the peace of knowing that when the door locks at night, you are the one holding the key.